Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior English B, and our objective now for the hour is to discuss here for just a few moments the classic novella, and that's where you want to start. We're not going to call this a novel necessarily. We're not going to call it a short story. We're going to call it a novella. That is to say, it's longer than a short story, it's shorter than a novel. Okay, and the novella that we'll be studying now today is Leo Tolstoy's classic, The Death of Ilych. The Death of Ilych. So let's have a little conversation. I want to do three things. With this text now for the next few minutes. One, we want to talk a little bit about the author of this text. Who is this guy named Tolstoy, and why should I care? All right. So, for example, if you Google this guy, like, what kind of information are they going to tell you about this guy? He's a fascinating man. He lived a fascinating life. Two, we want to look at the text, Death of Ilych, in terms of, as we would do any kind of annotation, in terms of plot structure and events and what happens and that kind of thing. And then finally, three, we want to make some summative comments about what does this text mean? What is the point of a text like this, and why does it continue to be an important read for a lot of students, for a lot of people? Let's begin with Tolstoy himself. Really fascinating guy. The first thing we want to point out about him is that many consider him the greatest writer of all time, if you're talking novels. Of course, we always say the greatest writer of all time is who? We always say Shakespeare. But if we're talking about the novel itself as an artistic form, this Russian writer is often considered the greatest. Many argue that he wrote the single greatest novel of all time. Namely what? Does anybody know? What's the name of the greatest novel of all time ever written? Tolstoy wrote it. It was called War and Peace. You might want to write that title down. It's one of the great Mount Everest novels. So, for example, if you want to consider yourself having read a really important book, you can pick up this book and try and read it. It's no small feat to get through this thing. It's a number of pages long. It's usually considered in the top 5 greatest novels ever written, and many people argue it's the greatest novel ever written by this cat named Tolstoy. The other novel that he wrote that's really famous is a novel called Anna Karenina, which is a really controversial novel at the time. Some of you maybe know about Anna Karenina because, of course, it became a movie of just recently. A story about a woman who's married and has children. She falls in love with this guy. He's young, he's stunning. Ultimately, it doesn't work out, and she kills herself by jumping in front of a choo-choo train. That's at the end of the novel. It's a very controversial novel for its day because Anna Karenina will choose death than to live unhappy. All right? So it goes. What are we going to say about this guy, Tolstoy? Well, he's a very fascinating guy. I like this little statistic. The day he was born in a house that had 50 bedrooms. That was the one house of several that the family owned. He grows up exceptionally wealthy. This will be influential, by the way, in our text as we study it. He grows up exceptionally wealthy. His term normally that we use for him is an aristocrat. Of course, he is an aristocrat. I mean, he grows up with wealth. He grows up with power, with prestige. All his life he knew servants who took care of him, that kind of thing. Okay. At a given pivotal moment in his life, however, for reasons that are really problematic, I mean, there's lots of debate about why, Tolstoy walks away from his life of wealth. Now, in the meantime, he was already a very accomplished writer. And he walks away from his life of extreme wealth to live a life of poverty. Are you ready for this? He dies alone in a train station as a homeless guy. This guy who was worth millions and billions of dollars, and he walks away from all of it. By the end of his life, he's what we will call an extreme pacifist. His study of Christian theology has led him to write The Kingdom of God is Within You, a classic text. It's one I always recommend, especially if you have any interest in Christian thought, where Tolstoy says it's a pretty radical theology that Jesus Christ taught in the Sermon on the Mount and elsewhere. And if you actually apply the teachings of Jesus Christ, well, you're going to live a radically different life than most Christians call the Christian existence. And it will begin with conflict resolution And that will begin with pacifism. And so his views here are quite radical. When he dies, nobody knows for a while. He's for a few hours. It's not like it's being followed on face filth or something like that. I mean, he dies and nobody knows. But then, of course, people begin to mourn his passing. And of course, already people are starting to talk about him as one of the greatest writers who ever lived. Buried in his oeuvre, and there's a lot of text that he wrote, is a classic little novella called The Death of Ivan Ilych. We want to talk about that text now, in preparations for the exam for you that's coming. A number of years ago, I wear a lot of hats as the work that I do. A number of years ago, I was privileged to be on a humanities council. And that was pretty cool. We got together and we talked about humanities projects around the state, blah, blah, blah. But one weekend in the summer, many, many years ago, we were told we were going to get to have a little getaway vacation for several days. And we went to this place in Wyoming, a dude ranch out in the middle of nowhere. And they flew in a guy who was a Russian scholar who lectured at Harvard and Brandeis University in Boston. This guy had just recently translated Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilych, and he was going to do a round table where all of us as academics would sit in a room and we would talk about this novel. It was one of the more remarkable academic moments of my life. This guy is a Russian scholar, a classicist, and he had just translated this novel, and he was prepared to talk about it in depth. He made the argument, and so I'll share it with you, that The Death of Ivan Ilych is one of the greatest things Tolstoy ever wrote, because it's so autobiographic. It is, in fact, Tolstoy himself coming to terms with his own mortality, his own death, the potentiality of his death, although written way before 1910 when he finally dies alone in that train station. Now, what are we going to say about The Death of Ivan Ilych? Well, it's an interesting little short novel, a novella, as we said we call it. It begins with, interestingly, to speak of narrative structure for a moment, it begins with the end. Yeah, with the end. It begins with the end. Ilych has lived and now is dead. There are one or two survivors for Ilych. Of course, his wife, his son, his colleagues. All of them, both family and colleagues, have this strange response to his passing, which looks and sounds almost like that line from T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, well, that's done, and I'm glad it's over. They're almost relieved at the beginning of the novel. They're almost relieved that finally, he's gone. Done. And right away, it's interesting how the people who are around Ilych begin to talk in two directions. One, well, at least it wasn't us. Two, money. Right? Money. How much currency? How much money? And of course, by extension, power. Which leads then the reader to want to know about this cat named Ilych. Who is this guy? And why is it that at his passing, there are not more tears shed? Who is this guy? The novel then will tell us who this guy is. And for the rest of the novel, we're going to be told about this guy named Ivan Ilych. In a word, we can say it this way. This is the story of a very successful man. Unbelievably successful. He lives, of course, in Russia. He finds himself in and out of jobs, struggling to try and find the right kind of professional position. Ultimately, he becomes a famous judge. He reports that he loves it when the criminals are brought in front of him and he has total power to do to them whatever he wishes. He can send them away to the work camps where they will for sure die, or he can show mercy and he can pardon them. And it all comes down to him. Wonderful. His life is going quite well. He marries a woman for wealth, power, not for love. And then, of course, he has to have an appropriate place to live. He buys a nice home, and he's going to begin the renovation process. Ironically, during the renovation process, while he is up on a ladder, ironically hanging curtains, I should pause here at 2b and make an observation. Tolstoy is a stylistic genius. Nothing is ever arbitrary or thrown into one of his texts. Nothing. Everything is intentional. It's the kind of writer that he was. No mistakes with Tolstoy. Everything's intentional. He's hanging curtains. And he slips and he falls. And he bangs his side against the window. Sometimes translated to the window frame. It would be not unlike maybe, for example, my window being open and then falling, and then you just hit your side, your rib area. Bam! Ow! A little bit of a bruise. No broken rib. Just a bruise. He doesn't think anything about it. Until a few weeks later, this pain in his side has not diminished. The bruise has not gone away. And a few weeks after that, he begins to have a foul taste in his mouth. And he begins to realize something is wrong. The physicians are called in, the experts. And they are not sure what's going on. And in fact, Tolstoy himself never actually calls it cancer. He just describes it as cancer. It's some kind of growth within the body. It's interesting to watch how the physicians relate to Ilych. Are you ready for this? The physicians relate to Ilych the way he as a judge used to relate to those people that were brought in front of him. Ilych tries to give the doctors his own view, and the doctors treat him like a child. He does not like this. Yes, 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 you people without these medical degrees, you love to have your little opinions about what's wrong. Why don't you let us, the experts, tell you what to do? And Ilych is like, you're not hearing me. This is painful. We need to do something and do something. Yes, yes, I know. The doctor's protocol is very condescending, and Ilych loathes it. Nobody understands he is in pain. Not just a little pain, a lot of pain. And pain that is increasingly growing worse and worse. And then it hits him. This is a pain that might not ever go away. It is a pain that no doctor can heal. This is the pain that will lead to my death. Now we read this novel because it's quite fascinating to study the psychology of the impending mortality. Ilych plays games with himself. Games, for example, from an old primer about all men being mortal, and all men, because they are mortal, must die. I am a man, and therefore I must die. And logical analyses in the Aristotelian trends that say, basically, dude, you gotta get jacked. You gotta go. Ilych comes to his final moments, and they are horrific. There's no other adjective to describe it. Complete and total horror. The pain has become immense. He grows thin. Food no longer tastes good to him. He grows weak. He cannot sleep because of the pain. He'll move in and out of nightmares. He can't sleep. He is haunted by the night, but more haunted by the sunrise. Because that means one more day of excruciating pain, which will culminate in a night of no sleep to give rise to another day of more horrific pain in his side. The thorn in his side is soon to kill him. But what happens around him is quite fascinating. His family, especially his wife and daughter, in a very famous scene, have had enough of it. We don't need to hear any more about your pain. Yes, 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 you're sick, we get it. We're going to the opera. And they get all dressed up to leave, to go to the opera. And on their way out the door, it hits Ilych. If the roles were reversed, if he was the well one, and she was the sick one, he'd do the exact same thing. He'd do the exact same thing. Why? Because the healthy never want to be with the sick. It is troubling. Troubling? Why troubling? It is troubling because it reminds the healthy that soon you won't be healthy. And that is unsettling. Much easier to dress up and go out on the town to the opera. There is only one individual who remains by Ilych's side, which would make sense because Ilych is a very powerful and wealthy man and he has servants. And of course, his servant, what's his name? Grayson. Yeah, Grayson is his servant. And Grayson has a very interesting temperament. Grayson, we're told, is always smiling. He's always happy. And at the end, Ilych is in such horrific pain that the best relief for that pain is if his legs are held at a certain incline, and his legs must be held there. And his servant will allow for the legs to lay across his shoulders, and Grayson will sit there for long hours doing absolutely nothing, not moving, so that Ilych can have some momentary relief of this extreme pain in his side. And during it all, Ilych's servant, happy to be of help. Happy to be of help. A complete innocent. And in the process, Ilych comes to his final 3 days. He begins to have dreams. He dreams of what? He dreams of a... It's hard to translate out of the Russian. It's often the English word is sack or bag, or some have even translated it as a pillowcase. That is to say, some kind of holding that's black. And there's this fear that he's going to get pushed inside of this. Of course, the metaphor is fairly self-evident. This is, if you will, the hand of death. This is the third visitation in the Scrooge motif of Charles Dickens' The Christmas Carol. The relations here are fairly self-evident. This is the moment when it's actually going to happen. See, it's one thing to just go out and to be hit by a car and immediately, instantaneously die. Years ago, I was lecturing in a summer school situation, and one of my summer school students, a high school student who had just graduated, was riding his bike to evening class. I was parked at a red light, stopped at a red light right in front of the Maverick. And I saw him coming on his bike. I was pointed in the direction that was going east out of town. It was late afternoon. The sun was shining really brightly behind us, setting in the west. And the sun was hitting the lights. It was a red light. But I looked in my rearview mirror and I saw a semi-truck that was gearing up, not down, as he was coming towards the red light. He didn't see that it was a red light. He was going to run through this red light. And my instincts immediately looked left and right, obviously, because I was in the other lane. And all of a sudden I saw my student on his bike, headphones in. And he was pedaling hard because he didn't want to be late to class. Our class started in 15 minutes. And there he came. And there came the truck. And neither of them were clearly seeing the other. And my student went right through the green light. Makes sense, right? He was pedaling his bike. And all of a sudden, I did not see him anymore. But I saw the front end of that truck just right through the red light. Never saw it because the sun was pointing against. And I did one of these because I was like, already, I was wondering if I had to reach for my phone to call 911. And the truck was long. So it took probably a second and a half before it finally went by. And I look up, and there he is, in his bike. He had no idea, zero clue. A few minutes later, I walk through this door, and there he is, all happy. Hey, Mr. Geese, Grayson. And I had the weirdest feeling of, dude, you have no idea. And then the question for me was, do you tell him? Right? Do you tell him? Do you say, let me tell you what the ride to class tonight was for you and for me, and potentially for a driver of a truck who for both of us will remain anonymous, because who knows what he was, who he was. I decided to tell him, and in my telling him, I realized that I was playing the game of Tolstoy's Death of Ilych. There's two ways to go. One way is the way my pal, my student, almost went. He would have never known it, and it would have been over. It would have been instantaneous. Bam! 1 minute you're listening to your favorite tunes, saying, just a few more classes, I'm done with my first class of summer school. And the next minute you're not. Done. Bam! That's one way to go. The second way to go is Ilych's way to go. You see the train coming from a long, long ways away, and you know it's headed right towards you, and you cannot get off the track. There is no one to get you off the track. The doctors keep saying, we're doing the best we can. We're doing the best we can. You need to have patience. Try this one more medicinal protocol. Try this, try that. In the end, it's not about curing the illness. It's about surviving the pain. The pain ongoing. And then, for Ilych, the last 3 days. His wife will report, it's terrible. He starts moaning and groaning. And the moaning gets louder and louder until the last 3 days, it's a constant. Often the word is translated out of the Russian, howl. H-O-W-L. The great poet Ginsberg will write a whole poem called Howl, in some ways a tribute to this word that will be translated out of the Russian. His long 3 days, she says, it's ongoing. He just goes until his voice is tired, and then he can't, and then he rests for a few, and then he's back at it again, screaming, just screaming as loud as he can. 3 days. Non-stop. She says, everywhere in the house you went, you heard him. His screams. It's horrific. Horrific. As he goes to the end. And then, the end. Which is a fascinating end. There's lots of debate about, even in the translation itself, the language that is going to be used. Tolstoy's Ilych comes to some realizations at the very end of his life. After the 3 days of howling, he finally is ready to accept, this is it. This is it. I will die now. And in those moments of epiphany, enlightenment, we might say, he comes to realize and to accept that his life has actually not been that well lived at all. And that in fact, he's never really been happy with the life that he chose. And he realizes how isolated he is from those who he was closest to, especially his son. And in a final moment, he has a very powerful, touching moment. It's the reason why you should read this novel through its entirety to the end. There's a moment with his son, an identification, we might say, in some ways, right? And in that identification with his son, he is ready finally to leave. There is some worse whispered words about it's over. His response seems to be not that it's finished, but rather it's begun. The next journey. And Ilych dies. It's the end of the story. There's no shock here. The title of the novella is The Death of Ivan Ilych. Right. So it's not like we are surprised by this ending. But now let's move to the last part of our conversation. And that is a discussion of the implications of a work like this. Who is this Ilych and why should we care? We have a number of questions that we can ask about Ilych. What went wrong? What went wrong? What do you mean what went wrong? Dude, he slipped and he fell and he hit himself on a window. No, not that what went wrong. We know that happened. And that, of course, led to a bruise, which led to an internal bit of ill health, and ultimately this is the cause of his death. We know that what went wrong. The question is, with his life, What went wrong? This novel suggests some really important observations that high school seniors do well to heed. The first one maybe runs something like this. It's a term you've heard before, many times. But maybe before a novella like this, it doesn't ring as powerfully true. And that is this: you are your choices. Ilych is his choices. And what were those choices? Well, those choices were made around a certain kind of understanding of what it means to be happy, what it means to be successful. And for Ilych, it's very simple. It's fame and it's fortune. It's money and it's power. If he has power, then he will be happy. He wants to live a life where other people look at him and go, I wish I could be like you. I wish I could have what you have. I wish I could wield the power that you wield. Ilych has convinced himself that everything he's ever done has been for his happiness. And he thought he was happy, in a way. He thought he was content, in a way. And he thought he was safe. He assumed, like most people assume, that he would live into old age. And in old age be surrounded by those things which made him happy. Namely, his stuff and his people. And then he gets sick. And slowly he starts to come to some realizations about those two things. His stuff and his people. First, his stuff. He begins to realize, funny observation, a brand new truck is only fun to have if you're healthy enough to drive it. If you don't feel good, you can have all the stuff in the world. If I right now were to give you $10 billion, you would say, yay, I can do whatever I want. But if your prognosis of a death that would be coming in the end of the next month would happen, all of a sudden the obvious question is, you can't have any joy with stuff if you don't have your health. All of a sudden, Ilych realizes, I could be a multi-billionaire, and if I ain't got good health, none of it matters. All of it was for nothing if I don't have my health. I got money, I'll bring in doctors. How do the doctors treat him? Like he's a child. You foolish little man. Why don't you let us do our job? He does not like the fact that he is a powerful man. I'm sorry, he was a powerful man. And these people now, these doctors, treat him as if he's a nobody. He's nothing more to them than a patient who needs to be told, stop whining. His money, his power, his prestige buys him nothing. Whoa. All of the time, energy that he's expended to collect all that stuff now seems to him not only a waste, but a joke. It was kind of useless. Well, the other thing is his people. Now, this here it becomes quite fascinating. Surely, he assumes, as I begin to grow into terrible pain, the people who I love and the people who love me will take care of me, will provide for me, will share in my pain, will be not only sympathetic, but empathetic. And then it hits him. There's a huge difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy says, oh, dude, you're coughing up blood and terrible stuff, and you got a bad taste in your mouth because you're dying. I feel really bad for you. That's sympathy. Empathy is, I've been there before. I know what you're going through. I know what you're feeling. It hits Ilych. No one can empathize with the dying. Now that is interesting. Nobody can empathize with the dying, not even the doctors. Why? Because they're all healthy. they're not dying. At least not to the degree that Ilych is. And because of that, Ilych realizes he is totally alone. Reminding us of the great Joseph Conrad line from Heart of Darkness, we live as we dream, alone. And at the end of his life, the people who he loves and the people who love him, he comes to realize, wow, the people in my life are kind of like the stuff in my life. They were there for my purposes when I needed them, but I've got no relationships with them. And ironically, the only one with whom he has any identification is his servant who takes out his poop in a pail and throws it away, smiling about it. The one that will hold his legs at a certain trajectory so that the pain can alleviate for 10 minutes, so he can nap for 10 minutes before the pain comes back with her onrush. That's the only one that stays by his side. It's the only one that takes care of him. Of course, at the beginning of the novel, this servant will just make the observation offhand, everybody's got to die. Which is Tolstoy's way to say what to the reader? We have a tendency to read this novel and go, oh man, it would suck to be Ilych. And Tolstoy reaches out from the pages and says, well, you're different? So you're not going to die. Oh no, I know I'm going to die. Oh, you know you're going to die. That's an interesting word, know, as in K-N-O-W. You do notice most people live their lives saying, I know I'm going to die, as in N-O. Not K-N-O-W. No, I know I'm going to die. Really. The way Ilych knew he would die. The human psyche has an interesting tendency to put in the back of our mind that which we fear the most. And what is it we fear the most? Ilych has to come to terms with it. It's that black sack. It's the moment of cessation. It's the moment of flatlining. Because it begs a really intriguing question. What happens then? What do you mean what happens then? They come in, they cart your body off, it goes someplace. They either put it under the ground, they burn it up, they do something with it. No, that's not his question. What happens to me? Dude, did you not just hear me? We bury you. No, I know that's what happens to my body. But what happens to my mind? What happens to my spirit? What happens to my soul? What happens to that? Well, that's an intriguing question. And by the end of his life, Ilych comes to terms with the fact he has lived his whole life knowing that the moment was coming, but being unaware of it. What would it be like to know it's coming? Well, now that's an interesting question. Tolstoy challenges the reader to say, you knew the moment you flushed your first goldfish. You knew the moment you had to bury your first dead dog. You knew the moment that you had to stand next to a grave when you were a child and everybody else was crying. You were like, dude, what's going on? Like, what's going on? You knew early on. You knew. And yet, we live our lives as somehow unaware of this knowledge. Why unaware of this knowledge? Ilych suggests, the novella suggests to us, if there's any single thing you do in your life, it probably makes sense to ask the Socratic question, what will the end be like for you? How will you come to that end? We watch Ilych come to his end, and we cannot help but pity him. What would it be like to be dying as a multi-billionaire and money cannot save you, and power cannot save you? And the people who you thought loved you want to get out of the house because they cannot be around you. Looking at you and you're dying is uncomfortable. Moving you away maybe to a special room in a special building might make the most sense. And then the screaming starts for him. It's an interesting question. Why scream for 3 days? It cannot just be physical pain. Why scream for 3 days? Right? What is it that he's trying to come to terms with? What is it that he has to come to understand? What does it mean to die? What does it mean to live. For Tolstoy, these two ideas are interchangeable and should be. Your going has everything to do with your coming. Your dying has everything to do with your living. Some of us die long before we're dead. Ilych was dead long before he fell on that window. He didn't understand what mattered in his life. It took his illness for him to come to terms with what it is he did not have. In the same way that, remember, I referenced it already in Dickens' famous tale, Scrooge is only a little bit upset when the first two ghosts appear. It's that third one that points at the tombstone that makes Scrooge beg for his, not his death, beg for his what? His life. But he had his life. In the same way that Ilych had his life. You are your choices. You are your choices. And what does it mean? And as I stood telling that young man how close he came, he at first wanted to know if I was serious, if I was kidding. He could tell I was not kidding. And then it hit him. Whoa. I guess that means this is kind of like a gift, this hour or two after that. Yeah. As if your life has ever been anything but that. An amazing, a precious gift. Because you don't know what truck's waiting, or what window to fall on is waiting. Something inconsequential leads to Elych's death. But then in the end, it's all inconsequential. Right? Well, there you go. An introduction to Tolstoy's Death of Ivan Ilych. Do your best to enjoy reading, and we'll come back to test.